Please be warned, this episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and atrocities against people, which may be alarming to some listeners.
When I arrived at the camp, it was not yet completely fenced off. Only later at some point in the summer was the barbed wire fence finished. I remember that at the moment of my arrival, there was a mud in the camp which thundered up into my ankles. I saw gypsies working at leveling the road in the gypsies camp with a roller. In the gypsy camp, I found my aunt who looked after me. I worked along with the other gypsies at demolishing houses that stood in the vicinity of the camp. A great many gypsies ran away from the camp, but these escapes turned out badly for them. The ones who were caught were taken to Auschwitz main camp and shot there.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us for episode 4. Today we're going to be talking about the 19th of January. The testimony that you just heard is by Jan Kwiatkowski. He was a Polish Roma who received the number Z5573 when he arrived to the camp. And I guess we're starting with me today. There's no Soviet advancement, so no start from Chris, but we're going to continue with this evacuation of prisoners. And it's today that at 1 a.m. there's a large transport of 2,500 prisoners that leave the camp and they join a column from Birkenau. So these guys are leaving from the main camp and they're joining a column from the Birkenau of roughly about 1,000 prisoners. So we're talking about a huge amount of people that are marching through the streets of Rajsko, for example, or Święcim, and they're later joined by another 1,000 people. So if my mathematics are correct here, that's 2,500 plus 1,000, that's 3,500, that's 4,500 people. You could not imagine seeing all of these people pass by your window. And I mean, for this podcast specifically, we don't have these testimonies. I haven't included them, but if you do get a chance to read more about the evacuation process, you'll come across testimonies of people where they're saying that, you can see people as far as the eye can see. These people who are dirty, smelly, tired skeletons slowly trudging through the snow. In these transports, they're also passing the bodies of their fellow murdered prisoners from the previous march. At one point, they counted almost 115 people who'd been shot by the roadside. The last group of these prisoners that leave Auschwitz, they leave at 4 a.m. that day. And they managed to reach their location in Wodzisław Śląski on the 22nd. So these people are marching for nearly 3 days. Once they'd arrived at their location, they were loaded into freight trucks and then directed to Mattenhausen, and they arrive in Mattenhausen on the 26th of January. At the same time, the SS entering the men's hospital, they take away anyone deemed fit enough to work to start clearing the dead bodies and putting them in crematoria 5. By this stage, you've got to remember, however much we've talked about crematorias 2 and 3 and 4. 4 has been destroyed. 2 and 3 have been dismantled. Crematoria 5 is still functioning, and it's going to function for another few days, and we'll talk about Crematoria 5 in a couple of days. Let's have a listen to the testimony of Jan Dziobek. He also was evacuated from Auschwitz on this day.
19 January 1945, at about 1 a.m., I crossed the gate of the Auschwitz camp for the last time. The night was clear and cold. There were millions of stars in the sky, and the moon was full as if it were smiling at us, asking, "Where are you wanderers off to?" The stars were shining on us, but for many of us it would be for the last time. So as many would never reach the final destination called freedom. The snow, compacted on the road by the feet of the thousands before us, hindered our march because the road was very, very slippery. Sensing that it would be so, I had taken my cane with me, and with its support, I managed to keep up with my younger friends. I walked in deep depression because I knew that every step that moved us away from the camp took us further from our dream of freedom. I was walking because I had to, or I would get a bullet in my head. The march was very slow because we walked in a column of 2,500 people. Gaps would open up, which we had to close by running. Or sometimes we got too close to one another, forcing us to stop. Such a pace would tire even the finest walker, let alone weak and exhausted prisoners who weren't used to such hardships after a long stay in the camp. We were driven forward by SS men, spaced every few steps on both sides of the road. Many of us couldn't stand such a pace, so they stopped and herded on with rifle butts and sticks courtesy of the SS men. In one day of walking on one side of the road, one of our friends counted 107 corpses, the majority of whom were from women, marching in front of us. Jaszowice was up ahead of us. Suddenly, a burst of machine gun fire rang out from the train station, and bullets whistled over our heads. We ran off the road without being ordered to and dug our heads down in the roadside ditches. The SS men lost their heads, and their faces were a picture of fear and helplessness. On the other hand, we felt revived and could hardly conceal our joy. Perhaps it was the Soviets' armored division, or maybe the partisans, whose activities we heard much about. Maybe they would surround us, maybe they would take us in, and then our dream would come true, our longed for freedom.
So we also need to go back to some of our subcamps on this particular date, and specifically back to Gleiwitz. It's a name we're hearing a lot as this podcast is going on. Gleiwitz 3 is a subcamp that was located at a disused mill, and the first transport of prisoners was sent there at the end of July 1944. They were put up in a masonry factory building. At first, they worked at putting the grounds in order, erecting a barbed wire fence, unloading machinery, and installing it in the factory halls. It just always comes into my mind when I'm reading and talking about stuff like this, that these guys had to make their own camps. They had to make their own hell. It's awful, isn't it? So production started up later in 1944. The prisoners were employed to make train car wheels, chassis for flak cannons, components for naval mines, and artillery shells. So hard, heavy, dangerous work. There were between 450 to 600 male prisoners. The tally on the 17th of January 1945 was 609 prisoners. 2 days later, on the 19th of January, they were evacuated on foot, but they were soon turned back to the vacant Bleichhammer subcamp. From there, some of them joined prisoners from other subcamps on a march to Grossrosen. Others managed to hide, and some managed to escape. Those who could not do so were shot by the SS shortly before liberation. At the same time, about 380 were evacuated from Gleiwitz 4 and headed towards Sosnowiec, but after a few kilometres, they were also turned back to the Bleichhammer subcamp. In this short time and this short march, the SS still had time to murder 50 prisoners. A few of the prisoners were moved to Grossrosen or Buchenwald, but several also escaped in the confusion, hid in the woods, in the forest. They ate roots and bark, took water from the snow, and managed to survive for several days until the liberation. At Gleiwitz 4, the 57 prisoners who were too weak to leave were locked into the sick bay, and the building was set on fire by the SS and the Orgtold men. Anyone who tried to escape through the windows was shot, and only 2 men managed to survive, Dabrowski and Rosenfeld.
There's an excellent testimony by Zdeněk Baron that talks exactly about that. So let's have a listen to what he's got to say.
Lech beat me with a board and a rubber in the head, back, and all over the body. This happened during work at the camp when we were digging a ditch. I saw Lech beat and abuse prisoners who committed the most trivial offenses or none at all. On 19th January 1945, the camp was evacuated to the west. About 50 prisoners, unfit for marching, stayed behind in the sick room. The sick room was burned 3 days later, and these ill people burned along with it. I don't know who gave the order. I learned this from one Dąbrowski and another from Häftling. They were the only people from the group of sick prisoners who survived. They told me about this incident when I saw them in the spring of 1945 in Łódź. They survived because they managed to jump from a window of the burning building and hide among the corpses of those who were shot when they were jumping out. On the first day of the march, about 20 kilometers from Gleiwitz, I saw Lech shoot a Häftling who couldn't walk any longer. I didn't see Lech shoot anyone else. Considering all the crimes and atrocities committed by Lech, the fact that he gave orders to beat and torment us during the march isn't really worth mentioning. After 2 days of marching, we reached Blechhammer. On the second day of the march, I saw Lech for the last time around noon. I don't know if he left the column. I suspect that 3 hours before we reached Blechhammer, he drove ahead by car. I never saw him in Blechhammer, but I saw the car he would drive with the Lagerführer.
I am basically going to really touch super quick on the Hindenburg camp. The Hindenburg camp was a small work camp set up to work on making trucks to transport arms to the Donnersmarck steel mill, as well as providing labour for one of the local mines, and it housed around 70 men and 469 women. And this is a statistic that we know as of the 17th of January. The camp life more or less continued, and the men served as custodians and cleaners, and the women were employed at making carts as well as grenades and artillery shells. I find that really odd that, they've Kate, I can see you nodding away here, that there's kind of this sort of switch, this gender role switch, especially at this time. The men decide to be the custodians and the women are wouldn't you think it would just be the other way?
Well, you certainly think that some of the women would take on that role. But I guess you've got men in charge of the women. Have we got functionary prisoner thing going on here? I don't know, but it does seem very strange. It's certainly something I've never come across before.
The women tend to have nimbler fingers and can get into smaller things for the shells.
There you go. So it's a gender role switch because women have nimbler fingers. Coming back to this though, Johanna Bormann, some of you might have heard of her, but some of you might not have. She is one of the female SS officers that worked in the camp. She actually arrived from Ravensbrück and she ended up in Birkenau first before going to Hindenburg, and that's where she evacuated with prisoners. She actually ended up being tried with Josef Kramer. Josef Kramer was the man who was the commandant of Birkenau, not the whole Auschwitz complex, but Birkenau itself. They were tried in the Belsen trials and both of them were actually sentenced to death. She was known as the woman with the dogs because she always had her dogs around her. She was a horrible, violent, vile human being that pretty much deserved what she did in the Belsen trials. And of course, as always, the line is, oh, well, I didn't mean to, I didn't really hit anyone, or, those silly things that we always hear. We're going to come back to that because otherwise I'm going to digress to this. Anyway, she comes in and organizes the prisoners, each with a blanket, some bread, and she marches them out. Can anybody guess where they go to? Gleiwitz, exactly. So they end up there on the evening of the 19th, and they get loaded onto trucks for Grossrosen. They actually end up refusing the women when they get to Grossrosen because it was just severe overcrowding. You can imagine this right now. The Auschwitz complex of, about over 50,000 people are being evacuated from the camp and its subcamps, and they're ending up in all of these other concentration camps that are just, they can't, where are they going to put these people? They can barely house their own prisoners, let alone housing all of these others that are arriving. So the women get refused from Grossrosen, and then they're moved continuously for another 2 days to Bergen-Belsen. It was a very difficult situation for those women and men.
Which leads us to the final subcamp of Scharlagruber, where you've got another 833 prisoners. They're also moved out to an estate near the Oder, with the usual weak and stragglers being shot along the way. On the 22nd, they're moved off to the rail hub, and they're also transported off to Mauthausen. Finally, we've also got Sonderkommando Katowice, which is evacuated with 10 prisoners and 50 Gestapo officers to Lower Silesia, basically moving a large amount of the Gestapo's documents that they haven't got round to burning, and they're doing so in a couple of wagons, and they end up joining a Wehrmacht convoy. There they encounter the Soviets on the road, which then turns into a bit of a shootout, but they manage to move on. So they managed to get to Kłodzko, where the Gestapo's documents are all unloaded and put into a tile factory. and the prisoners are then housed in the city jail, where one of them does get shot by the Gestapo.
Well, that's the end of episode 4 of the Auschwitz Liberation podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you want to support us further, then please consider joining our Patreon, where you can find extra content day after each episode is aired. Just head to patreon.com/moments_in_time. Or if you don't want to sign up but want to give us a one-off payment, then you can do so at ko-fi.com/momentsin time. And don't forget to rate us on your favourite listening platform. Thank you so much again, and see you all on the 21st for episode 5.